Many people reach their 60s, believing that losing strength in their legs, feeling their knees stiff at dawn, or climbing stairs slowly is simply an inevitable part of getting older. But the ancient elders of the Great Plains observed something different. Even past the age of 70, many of them continued walking long distances in the cold, carrying firewood, setting up camps, and moving with a resilience that impressed even the younger members of the tribe. And all of this while spending hours beside old clay pots, where a thick broth made from bison bones simmered slowly for nearly 2 full days. Perhaps what they valued was not just the food itself, but the way they sustained the body across an entire lifetime. Because there was a detail in that ancestral preparation that almost no one today notices. While the modern world began chasing quick solutions, those peoples believed that the strength of the body had to be built slowly, exactly like the low fire that kept the broth warming through the entire night. And further along, you will understand why the bones, the marrow, and even the silence around that pot were all considered an important part of this ancient ritual. There is a belief that modern life has quietly planted in us, that what happens to the body after 60 is mostly beyond our control, that the stiffness, the fatigue, the heaviness in the joints, these are just the body doing what bodies do. But the elders of the Plains nations saw aging from a completely different angle. They did not believe the body was meant to weaken steadily and without reason. They believed weakness came from how the body had been fed, or more precisely, from what had been forgotten over time. And one of the most important things they believed had been lost was this: the understanding that certain parts of the animal, the parts that most people today discard without thinking, were the very parts that sustained the body through a long life. The bones, the marrow inside them, the slow extraction of what those bones had been carrying for years. This was not a luxury meal. It was not a ceremonial dish reserved for special occasions. It was a regular part of life, consumed through cold winters, through demanding travel seasons, through the years when the body needed the most consistent support. And there was something about the way it was prepared that set it apart from almost everything we do in a kitchen today. Picture a camp on the northern plains in the deep of winter. The wind moves across the open land with a sound like low breathing. The sky is the color of pale stone. The ground is hard, and near the center of the camp, a fire burns low and steady. Not the high, bright fire of celebration, but the patient fire of preparation. Over it a pot, heavy, darkened by years of use. Inside bison bones, large ones, split open so the marrow is exposed to the water. Smaller ones cracked with a stone. Knuckle joints, feet, the pieces that carry the most of what the animal had built over its own lifetime. Water drawn fresh from a nearby source, cold at first, then warming, then slowly beginning to release what the bones had been holding. The broth would not be ready in an hour, not in 2. The elders who tended this fire understood that rushing the process would change what came out of it. The slow draw was the point. The patience was not inconvenience, it was the method. And more than once, a younger member of the tribe would ask, why so long? Why not simply cook the meat and eat? The answer they received would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The elders of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, and other nations of the Great Plains did not distinguish sharply between food and care for the body. To them, they were the same thing. What you put into the pot was a decision about how you wanted to feel in the months ahead. Not just today, not just this week, but through the long winter, through the season of hard travel, through the years when the body had already given so much and still needed to keep going. And the bison was at the center of that understanding. The bison was not simply a source of meat. Every part of the animal was used with intention. The hide for warmth, the sinew for tools, the organs consumed fresh after a hunt. And the bones. The bones were saved and used in a way that honored what that animal had carried. The marrow inside a large bison femur is rich, dense, and deeply nourishing. Traditionally, it was one of the most valued parts of the animal, not for its flavor alone, but for what the elders believed it provided to those who ate it regularly, a kind of deep sustenance that ordinary muscle meat alone couldn't offer. When split open and submerged in slow simmering water for many hours, the marrow would release gradually into the broth. The color of the liquid would deepen, the texture would grow thick and almost silky by the second day, And that texture had a name in the understanding of the elders. It was the sign that the broth was ready, that the bones had given what they had to give. But there was another ingredient in this preparation that almost no one outside these traditions would think to add. And it may be the detail that changes everything. The elders did not simmer the bones in plain water alone. Alongside the bones, they added what the land around them offered: wild onion, pulled from the earth near water sources, dried sumac berries, tart and deep-colored, which had been gathered in late summer and stored for exactly these winter preparations. Sometimes juniper berries, sometimes dried prairie turnip, which the women had harvested and preserved through the warmer months. Each of these additions had a reason, not a reason explained in scientific terms, but a reason passed down through generations of careful observation. The sumac added a sourness that the elders associated with something they could feel in the body after eating, a lightness, a clarity, a sense that the broth was easier to carry. It was traditionally valued in preparations meant to be consumed regularly over long periods, rather than as a single large meal. The wild onion was part of nearly every broth preparation across many plains traditions, valued by the elders for what they described as its ability to warm from the inside. Not the sharp heat of certain spices, but a slow, building warmth that stayed through the hours after eating. And the prairie turnip, dried, ground, or added whole, provided a starchy body to the broth that made it more substantial. Not a soup with visible pieces, but a broth with depth, with weight, with something that stayed with you through a long day of physical work. Think for a moment about what you typically eat for breakfast. How long does it hold you? How do you feel 2 hours later? The elders who began their mornings with a cup of this broth believed the body should feel supported for hours, not stimulated for 30 minutes and then empty. There is something else about this tradition that deserves attention, something that has less to do with what was in the pot and more to do with who was tending it. The preparation of the long broth was not rushed work. It could not be. A fire that burns too high destroys the slow process. A pot left unattended risks losing water, burning what had taken hours to build. The person who made this broth had to be present with it. They fed the fire small pieces of wood at regular intervals. They checked the level of the liquid. They skimmed what rose to the surface in the early hours. They adjusted. They watched. And in watching the pot, they were also resting, sitting near warmth, breathing slowly, not running between tasks. The elders described this kind of work as a form of care that returned to the person doing it. You tended the broth, and the broth, in a sense, tended you. This is something almost entirely absent from modern food preparation. We set a timer. We walk away. We come back when it signals. The process is managed, not experienced. But for those who spent hours near that low fire, something quieter was happening alongside the cooking. A settling, a slowing down, a kind of patience that seemed to live in the body afterward. Notice something for yourself. When was the last time you prepared food without doing anything else at the same time? Without a screen nearby, without a conversation running, without your attention divided across 3 different things? By the second day of simmering, the broth had changed completely. What had begun as clear water with bones in it was now a liquid with color and weight. If you set a cup of it outside in winter temperatures, it would thicken and eventually set. A sign, the elders said, of how much the bones had given. This broth was consumed in different ways at different moments of the year. During the hardest weeks of winter, it was the first thing consumed in the morning, warm in a clay cup held with both hands, before any movement, before any work, a way of beginning the body's day from the inside before asking anything of it on the outside. During times of travel or physical demand, small pieces of dried fat and pounded dried meat, what many know today as pemmican, were sometimes added to a portion of this broth to make a more complete meal that could sustain a person through many hours of exertion. And for the elders who were no longer traveling far, who spent more of their days in camp, the broth remained a daily habit into very old age, not because someone told them to drink it, but because they had drunk it their entire lives and understood, from experience, how different they felt on days when they had it versus days when they did not. There is something important in that, not a claim about what the broth could do in a clinical sense, but a recognition that the body keeps a long memory of what it has been given. The elders who were observed moving well into their 70s and 80s shared certain habits that the younger generations paid close attention to. The broth was one, but there were others woven into the same daily rhythm. They moved every day, not intensely, not in the way of training for something, but consistently and without interruption. Walking was not exercise for them. It was simply part of being alive. The body was meant to move, and so it moved. They ate with the seasons. What was available in winter was different from what was available in summer, and the body adapted accordingly. The heavy, warming broth of winter was replaced in warmer months by lighter preparations, fresh greens, berries, smaller animals. The body was never asked to eat the same thing every day throughout an entire year, and they slept according to the light. When it was dark, they rested. The length and rhythm of the night told the body how long to sleep. There was no resistance to the dark. It was welcomed, prepared for, moved toward, with the same intention that the broth received. These were not dramatic practices. They were not difficult to understand. But they required something that modern life has made rare: consistency without urgency. There is one more element of the bone broth tradition that deserves its own moment: the marrow. When the large bones were split open before going into the pot, the marrow was sometimes consumed directly, scooped out with a narrow tool, eaten warm, with nothing added. This was considered a separate act from the broth, more immediate, more direct. The elders who ate marrow regularly were described in oral traditions as people who moved well, who recovered from physical work without long periods of soreness, who remained strong in their hands and their legs into ages that surprised those around them. The language used was not medical, it was observational. They did not say the marrow caused anything. They said the people who ate it were a certain way, and the people who did not were another way, and over time the pattern was clear enough to pass down. This is the kind of knowledge that lives in lived experience rather than in studies, and it is exactly the kind of knowledge that gets lost when a culture stops asking the oldest people what they have noticed. Something is worth sitting with for a moment. We live in a time of extraordinary information about health and aging. More research, more products, more programs than any generation before us has ever had access to. And yet the experience of aging, for many people past 60, does not feel easier. It often feels more confusing, more overwhelming, more disconnected from the body. The elders of the Plains nations did not have laboratories or clinical trials. What they had was attention, decades of careful, quiet attention to what the body responded to, and the discipline to keep doing what worked, not because it was exciting or new, but because it had always worked. The bison bone broth was not interesting to them because it was ancient or traditional. It was interesting to them because it worked, because the person who drank it every morning through the winter moved differently than the person who did not, because the elder at 70 who had kept this habit through her life had something in her gait, in her hands, in her eyes, that the elder who had not kept it lacked. That kind of evidence, slow, patient, observed across generations, is a different kind of knowledge. Not better or worse than modern knowledge, but different, and perhaps more honest about the fact that the body responds to consistency more than to intensity. You do not need to track down bison bones to carry something from this tradition forward. The principle lives in something simpler, in the idea of slow preparation, of using the whole animal, of warming the body from the inside on cold mornings, of sitting with something that required patience to make. Beef bones, slowly simmered for many hours, produce a broth that follows the same logic the elders practiced. The addition of something acidic, a splash of vinegar or a handful of dried sumac, draws more from the bones over the hours of cooking. A piece of wild onion or regular onion, root vegetables, whatever the season offers. Not a recipe to follow precisely, but a practice to understand. Start the pot in the evening. Let it go through the night on very low heat. Wake to the smell of something that has been working quietly while you slept. Drink a cup in the morning, warm, with both hands around it before the day begins. That is closer to what the elders did than any quick preparation could be. The strength of the elders of the Great Plains was not a mystery they kept hidden. It was visible to anyone who watched how they lived, how they prepared their food, how they moved through the cold, how they spent their mornings, how they treated the ordinary acts of eating and resting as things worth doing with care. They aged. They felt the years. They carried grief and memory and the weight of long lives. They were not untouched by time, but they moved through time differently, with more ground under their feet, with more ease in the body that carried them forward. And perhaps that ease did not come from a single thing, not the broth alone, not the movement alone, not the sleep alone, but from the quiet accumulation of daily habits that told the body, over and over, across years and decades, you are being cared for. There is enough. You can keep going. That is a message the body never stops needing, at 60, at 70, at 80, and it was delivered every morning in a cup of something warm that had simmered through the night by a low and patient fire.